Okay, here we are. We are live. We are live. And okay, first, what we're going to do is we're going to attempt this watch party thing. So I'm going to go to a different screen, and let's see if I can start this watch party. And TJ, you're going to try to do the same thing.
I sure am. I'm doing it right now. There we are. Look.
Okay. This video is watch live. Okay, so watch live, or do I have to watch it live?
Yep. It should have a little button there that says start live watch party. I just started it on my end. So
okay, here we are. We are live. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it because I probably could do it on my phone. Let me see here if I could do it on my phone. So everybody's going to have to bear with me. I'm
technology,
here.
Everyone.
Technology. I know. I'm figuring this stuff out. I'm determined, but I'm grateful to be here with TJ Woodward. My name's Tim Westbrook. I am the host of I Love Being Sober. I love being sober. I love it. I love my life today, even in the midst of this pandemic. Actually, not even if. I would tell you that in the midst of this pandemic, if I wasn't clean and sober, I have no clue where I would be. And actually, I think about that quite often. There are a lot of people out there, because you hear that addiction rates are up, addiction's up, mental illness is up, suicide rates are up. I heard 600%. Yet we're seeing some people that are heading into recovery, but not as many as I would think. And my thought is that people are holed up and they're drinking, and especially the white collar workers. A white collar worker that works from home is continuing to drink, not getting in trouble, not drinking and driving, not going to bars, not causing trouble, not being around enough people that are going to start the intervention process. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Before we get into that though, okay, so I'm trying to multitask here, and I'm trying to start this live party, this live watch party. I'm not able to figure it out. Okay.
Well, I think your opening topic is so important, Tim, and I would love to dive into that because I think it's something that is important that we have a conversation about. So I'm really grateful that you opened with that, because I think it's really paramount right now, because it is true that the impact of the shelter-in-place policies have definitely created a secondary effect, if you will. So I look forward to exploring that more with you, because I think we don't even know yet the impact of it. Some of us have a sense of it, but we're not really going to know until next year how many people during this time struggled with mental health issues, struggled with addiction. And unfortunately, I know a lot of people who have committed suicide. I know some people personally who have, some former clients and people that I see posting on social media. So I think it is an important conversation to have.
Definitely. So, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you. I see you live. And there's a lot. I'm gonna read a little bit about you, just so I give people some context. So TJ Woodward is a revolutionary recovery expert, best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and addiction treatment specialist who has helped countless people through his simple, powerful teachings. He's the creator of Conscious Recovery Method, which is a groundbreaking and effective approach to viewing and treating addiction. TJ is also a featured thought leader on wholehearted.org, along with Brene Brown, Dr. Gabor Mate, and Mark Lundholm. He was given the honor of being ordained as an Agape minister by Dr. Michael Beckwith, and is also the founding minister of Agape Bay Area in Oakland, which was the first satellite community of the Agape International Spiritual Center in LA. TJ is the author of the best-selling books Conscious Being, Awakening to Your True Nature, and Conscious Recovery, A Fresh Perspective on Addiction. His third book, Conscious Creation, 5 Steps to Embracing the Life of Your Dreams, will be released in December of this year. TJ, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. And I love the title. I love being sober, because that's something that as you were speaking, it just reminded me the simplicity of that. Yes, I do love being sober. I love my life today. I'm so incredibly grateful for that being the very foundation, because I'm listening to the bio and I'm thinking, wow, none of that, absolutely none of that could have possibly happened without sobriety being the first step. When I was, pretty young, I guess young is relative, but in 1986, I got sober, and I'm so incredibly grateful that that was the foundation for me.
Wow. Yeah. So to give a shout out to Joe Polish, he has the I Love Marketing podcast, which is where I got the name from. He also is the owner of Genius Network and of Genius Recovery. And Joe Polish is going to be on the show here in sometime in October. So looking forward to having him on the show, but have to give him credit for the title, which you can relate. It's, you hear people at 12-step meetings and they say, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. Like, I love my life today. And I don't know about you, but I used to listen to them and I'd be like, you're lying.
Well, it's interesting because as you're saying that, I've had multiple people say to me, you were a teenager when you were active in your addiction. I got sober when I was 20. And how do you even know if you still have an issue with addiction or you're an alcoholic or an addict? And, I answer with the title of your show. I love being sober. I love my life today so much that that particular question isn't really relevant for me. Because I wouldn't want to, because people say, well, after all these years, don't you think you could maybe have a glass of wine? And that's not really the mindset for me. Really, it's about, I love my life in recovery so much that it wouldn't even be something that would enhance my life. It's not even a question today because of how much I love recovery. And I actually agree. I think I'm grateful that I had those addiction issues because it brought me into recovery. It brought me into my spiritual path. It made me really in a place where I was willing to start doing some of the deeper inner work. So in that way, without the addiction, I don't think I would have had the same need to start diving into some of what has now become this incredible life and a life that I do love.
Right. And I can relate 100%. It's and I've had people say, well, can't you just have a drink? It's like, I don't want to have a drink. Like, it's not worth the risk. My life is too good for me to even risk going down that path. And I know as long as I continue being grateful, as long as I stay connected to other people in recovery, I have those reminders that my life is amazing and that's not what I want.
Yeah, thank you. And and I love that we're talking about changing the narrative on recovery today, because there is, one framework that I think is really important that I really like to explore is looking at pure habit change. Take even addiction out of the equation. I read this pretty extensive study. I love extensive studies that come to these really simple conclusions. For example, they did an extensive clinical study on why some people had more anxiety about COVID than others. And in the end of this extensive study, what they discovered was people who had high levels of anxiety about COVID had higher levels of anxiety before COVID. So sometimes very simple,
that makes sense.
Yeah, but in terms of habit, they did a study and it was very, very simple. But we don't change habits based on what we don't want. We change habits based on what we do want. And I think that's what we're talking about. Because I think that I don't want to be hungover anymore, or I don't want to have my legal issues, or I don't want to, feel the way I did. That has a short shelf life. At some point, recovery for me becomes, what life do I want? Now I have this amazing life. I want to start cultivating that rather than being afraid that I don't want what was. It's really more about what are we going to create moving forward. And that's a very, very different framework for a lot of people.
It's putting energy into what I want. And
right.
You put energy into grows, right?
Absolutely.
So putting energy into what I want, not what I don't want. If you put energy into what you don't want, then then you're putting your eye on the wrong place. You got to put your eye where you want to go. By the way, this is live. Anybody that has a question for TJ, we're going to talk about creating a new narrative for recovery. That's going to be the main topic today. So if you have any questions, post them in the comments section. We can see your comments. If you know TJ, if you like TJ, give us a thumbs up, give us an emoji, say hello. We want to know that you're there. And so let's move on. And first, before we dig into it, I want to learn more about you, TJ. Where'd you grow up, and tell me what happened.
I like that question. What happened? It's a really good question. Right? What brought us to this moment? Right. So I grew up in Indiana, and it's actually interesting that you start with that question, because I grew up in Indiana in the 1970s, and I grew up in a time that had a particular paradigm, if you will, or a particular narrative. And I realized pretty quickly that I didn't fit into some of the narrative, right? And so I do remember coming into the world being very, very happy. And I also remember pretty early on an experience of wrongness, an experience of fear, an experience of, we hear this all the time, but like, I don't belong here. All of that started to happen. And so I shut down at a pretty early age, and I walked around feeling broken, feeling damaged, not good enough. And I walked around that way until I discovered drugs and alcohol at, 13, 14, started drinking, started using, got a lot of relief from that. That sense of disconnection. And that really is the thing. One of the narratives we hear in recovery is that we have to hit bottom. And for me, that's more of an internal, right? Because I felt so empty, so disconnected, and I was just trying to grab onto someone or something to feel better or to feel less. And I got sober at 20, been in recovery now for 34 years. I don't know how much of my story you want to know, but that began my journey, and then ultimately started working in the addiction field 12 years ago, created a new modality of treatment based on my experience. But that's the very, very short version of how I came to be sitting here talking to you.
Okay, so backing up. So when did you start experimenting with drugs and alcohol? Because you got sober at 20, which is young.
Yeah.
And when did you start experimenting with drugs and alcohol? And when did you realize you had a problem?
At around age 13 or 14, I started experimenting. I wouldn't say I realized I had a problem in the beginning, but it was very clear to me that I wanted a whole lot more of that. And it was almost like there was a felt sense of both relief and an uh-oh, even at that young age, because from very, very early age, I started blacking out, not remembering what happened the night before. And, one of the things I like to say is we don't call drinking or using an addiction as long as it's working. We call it fun. So, but my fun stage didn't last that long. It started causing problems in my life in high school. And so it was really young. It was a really great solution in the beginning. And unfortunately or fortunately, it didn't keep working that way.
So did somebody force you to get clean and sober, or did you just do it for yourself? Because I don't know about you, but for me, it was kind of like I was forced into this decision, and that was how I got sober first, but then it became my decision. That's the only reason it was able to. So for you, was the decision your decision from the very beginning, or was there an intervention?
No intervention for me, just an internal intervention. The last year of my drinking and using was really a very, very both painful and liberating time, because I discovered ecstasy, started using ecstasy almost every weekend for sure for that last year of using. And my whole inner world started to collapse. The outer world was doing okay. I somehow managed to keep my job and my apartment. And believe me, that was kind of a miracle that I managed to do that. But there was a sense of inner emptiness. And that to me is the key point. A friend of mine had gotten sober. So he had kind of planted the seed 6 months before I got sober. And I just kept feeling more and more disconnected and emptier. And the emptier I felt, the more I tried to drink and use more or have relationships or whatever it was to try to feel whole again. And so by the time I was ready to get sober, I ran into that friend that got sober, and I just asked him, hey, can I, find out what you're doing? And, started attending meetings with him, and I got sober at that point. So it was really ultimately my own choice. There wasn't some sort of outside influence saying I needed to get sober, but it was definitely that sense of inner disconnection that brought me to recovery.
Right. Well, it's as they say, the opposite of addiction is connection, right?
Right.
And so you're empty and you're attempting to fill that hole with drugs and alcohol, and it just wasn't working.
Right. And it was really, the way I say it is I had my umbilical cord in my hand trying to plug in. So it was relationships, anything, it was like a nightclub I went to, or drugs and alcohol. It was this search for like someone or something, please help relieve this inner emptiness. So it was really clear to me, in terms of what that one moment was that helped me to get sober. And it was really a long series of wanting something to change, but really not knowing how to do that. And really what I was searching for is a sense of spiritual wholeness. I didn't know that, but that was definitely what was happening.
So you got sober one time?
One time.
One time. Okay. And one of the things you talk about is that people say relapse continues to be accepted as part of recovery. For you, it wasn't part of your journey. For me, it wasn't part of my journey.
Yeah.
So why do you think it wasn't part of your journey? What did you do differently than other people do when you got sober?
Well, and in all fairness, I can say I never relapsed, but I also tried to control my drinking and using on my own for so long. So I remember going to therapy, for example, and I remember like signing a contract with my therapist that I wouldn't drink or use this week. And then, therapy was on Wednesday, and Thursday I would and then Friday I was using again. So I hadn't entered into recovery, but I do understand that experience of really wanting to stop and then not being able to. So I really think, as much as I would love to say to you, Tim, like, oh, I did this thing and I worked so hard at it, I just think that there was a sense of desperation and a surrender. And what's important to me about this conversation is what was different for me is that I was so disconnected and so bankrupt that when I discovered recovery, it was such a relief to me that I think I was willing to do whatever it took. But again, I'd love to sit here and say it's because I did it so perfectly, but the bottom line is I was so empty. And that theme continues. And that's why in conscious recovery, I identify one of the root causes of addiction as spiritual disconnection, because I was so disconnected from myself. So as much as I want to take credit for it, the bottom line is I was, as they say in 12-step, beaten into a state of reasonableness. I was ready to try whatever it took because of the emptiness that I was feeling.
Well, even if people feel empty and broken and they're willing to do anything, and then their life gets better.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, they're like, well, I think I got this. And so people end up in and out. I think that's one of the reasons why people end up in and out. Okay. So, and we can continue on that topic. There's just so much that we can talk about. When did you start why did you start working in recovery? And when did you start working in recovery? Like what led you to, because you got sober at 20 and then what did you do? You're sober. Not a lot of people are sober at 20.
Yeah, it's interesting because there were a lot of young people sober at that time and place for whatever reason. I think it was that sort of the beginning of treatment becoming really widespread. It was 1986. I had a lot of friends that were younger than I was that were getting sober at that point. I think about my friend Doug, who he had 10 years sober when I met him. He had gotten sober at 14. So I guess now he has like 45 years sober or something. He's still sober. He actually lives in Arizona. But there were a lot of younger people. But it's an interesting question because I didn't know what my purpose was. I didn't have any sense of that. So I was in retail. I kind of wandered around. Of course, my drinking messed up going to school after high school. So Later in life, much later in life, around 20 years sober, I had this calling to go into doing some sort of spiritual work. I didn't yet know it would be specific to recovery, or at least part of my work, but I followed that. I went back to school, and this was in my late 30s, got degrees in spiritual counseling and spiritual leadership, ultimately became ordained. And there was this piece of me that always had a heart for recovery. And I started working in a treatment program. They actually, it's an interesting story. They hired me as a driver, but by the time I actually started, I was a residential counselor. And then within 2 weeks, I was facilitating groups because I had such a passion for it. Krista Gilbert was my clinical supervisor. And I feel I almost want to apologize to Krista because I was so enthusiastic. I was like asking her every day, hey, I've got these groups I want to facilitate. And that was really the beginning of what is now conscious recovery. So I kind of came into this field through spirituality and wanting to bring some of what I had learned through my education into, and of course my own recovery, into the addiction treatment space. So that's kind of a long version, but that's how it all started.
Now, you grew up in Indiana. Did you get sober in Indiana?
I didn't. I moved to Dallas when I graduated from high school, got sober there.
Now, do you have siblings?
I do.
What, brothers, sisters?
Younger sister and an older sister.
Okay. And then your parents, was anybody in your family into active in addiction, alcoholic or drug addiction?
So this is a narrative I'd like to explore, right, in recovery. So the short answer is no, but there's a much longer answer too, right? There was no classic addiction in my family, but I think one of the narratives that we have about addiction is that it's genetic or that it gets passed down. And that may be true, but there are also all these other factors, right? I don't think there's one size fits all to addiction. And the reason I'm saying that is if someone's watching right now or listening right now and they think, well, I don't have addiction in my family, maybe I don't have addiction issues. That's one of the narratives that I think we could start to shift, because I couldn't point to it in my family. But after many years of doing some work and looking at, my past, I realized that there was actually a lot of addiction in my family. Not drinking and using, but
right.
On my dad's side, there's a lot of hypersexuality. There's a lot of sexual abuse that happened. On my mom's side, there's a lot of eating disorder. There's also a lot of rigidity and control. And so there are things that I look at now as addiction, but couldn't recognize when I first got sober.
Right, which is the same thing as alcoholic behavior, right?
Right.
It's alcoholic behavior. It doesn't mean that they're drinking or using. It's the behavior, right?
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting because when I would hear people in early recovery talk about growing up with an alcoholic parent, and they would say that they came home from school and didn't know which mom or dad was going to be on the other side of the door, I totally relate to that because my mom struggled with mental health issues, right? So she was either depressed or raging. And that was pretty consistent. And so I remember getting to the front door and wondering which mom would be on the other side. Am I going to get depressed mom, or am I going to get angry, rageful mom? So in that way, I really relate to that unpredictability and that confusion and that taking on a lot of the unresolved trauma of my parents, that generational trauma that I took on simply from being this wide open kid, that it was absorbing the energy, which, to me is all of us, right? We come into this world so open and we absorb the belief systems and the energy that our family systems, school systems, and any other communities we're part of. We take all that on. And I remember that from a very early age.
Right. Okay. So tell me about conscious recovery and why you created conscious recovery.
So in my own recovery and then in working in the addiction field, I noticed, which I kind of realized, but I got a much clearer picture, that most of the treatment focuses on symptoms and behaviors, right? How do we help someone get sober? As a matter of fact, Tim, you and I remember when mental health and addiction were considered totally separate, right? So in recovery circles, you weren't going to talk about your mental health issues. And in mental health, we weren't really going to address addiction. So if you hear like some of the old school people that were pioneers working in this field, they talk about like the mental health wing of the hospital being separate from the addiction wing. And the reason this is important is when I started working in the field, even 12 years ago, there was a strong focus on not only symptoms and behaviors, but also on brokenness, right? So a lot of the clinicians, therapists, and counselors are trained to diagnose and treat, which is really useful, but I also realized it was limited. And so I came into this field having this spiritual approach, which was let me help someone reconnect with their wholeness. And I asked myself the question, what would happen if I started looking for the wholeness in this person, or creating a space for someone to reconnect with their essential self? So depending on your perspective, you could call that their God self, their true nature, their Buddha nature. If it's true that underneath all addictive behavior is a whole and perfect person, how do we help someone get back to that, right? So that is really why I started Conscious Recovery. It's twofold. One, how do we start getting down to the actual root causes of addiction? And two, how do we help someone reconnect with their wholeness?
Okay, so you decided to start Conscious Recovery, and then what?
Well, it wasn't quite that clear. So I started working in the field. I developed these groups, like I said, I called them authenticity groups. It was really about helping people access their inner wisdom. That really had a lot of momentum. I was working full-time in the field. I created spiritual care programs for more than one residential treatment program. And then I wrote my book, Conscious Recovery. And honestly, Tim, I resisted that because I had already written my first book. I didn't really want to be pigeonholed as recovery, but one of the practices for me that has been so powerful is listening to inner wisdom. So as I was meditating, the message came through so clear: write a book about recovery. So I went about writing the book first, and then I partnered with a good friend to create a workbook. And then I started asking myself the question, wow, I wonder if the groups that I'm facilitating, I wonder if I could train others to do that. So that's how Conscious Recovery was born. It was a process, but now it's a modality of treatment that is integrated into many different treatment programs. And I go in and train clinicians not only on how to facilitate the groups, but even more importantly, how to hold a space and see our clients through the lens of their wholeness, and then looking at that observer effect and how we can start shifting how we view and treat addiction. Right.
Now, what's your opinion on the 12-step program? Are you a 12-step guy?
So I love 12 steps, and I'll just be really transparent. I attended 12-step for 20 years. It saved my life. I love 12-step programs. My path took me a different direction. One of the things that's really interesting, and your question I think is important, because a lot of times people ask me, is Conscious Recovery an alternative to 12-step? Absolutely not. It's an additional tool to work with whatever someone's doing. So if they're doing, refuge recovery, or they're doing therapy, or they're doing 12-step, it's something that can enhance it. So I have so much respect for the millions of people 12 steps have saved. And it was like, it was the foundation for me for 20 years of my recovery.
Yeah. And I think 12 steps is the foundation for the majority, really. I mean, it's like, I got sober through the 12 steps, and I've stayed connected. I still have a home group. I still have service commitments. I still sponsor guys. It's still part of my life, but then I've got all these other compliments. Yeah. And that's kind of the way I look at it, whatever it is. And there are times when I go to less 12-step meetings and I do more of this, more yoga, more triathlon training, more effort, more optimize, more ice bath, red light therapy, yoga, meditation. To your point, it's all spiritual and self-care and continuing to do the next right thing.
Yeah, and you spoke to it so beautifully earlier when we're looking at connection, right? So can I be part of a community that helps me connect with supportive people and connect with myself? And of course, 12-step does that brilliantly. You know, you can go anywhere in the world and you can walk into a room of, for the most part, very well-meaning people. So that is something that is brilliant about 12-step. And for some people, their path takes them a little different direction. A lot of people now are doing a hybrid, right? My friend, Dr. Jason Schiffman says a wrench is an incredible tool, but it doesn't necessarily fix everything. So a lot of people, and most people I know, have a foundation in 12-step, but they're also doing all these other things to complement that. And that's the beauty of the time we're living in. There are more opportunities now to build communities in different ways that help us connect with ourselves and others.
Now, how does conscious recovery, developing that program, how has that helped you?
So I will say it this way. When I was in early recovery, I felt so broken. I felt so damaged. And I met a woman named Mary Helen Brownell. She changed my life. And she changed my life in simply demonstrating a new way of looking at recovery. And so when I started working with her, my life changed dramatically. And it was this key point, was this brokenness or wholeness, because some of the narrative around recovery is that, you know, you have a lifelong illness, a chronic disease. There's something fundamentally broken about you. I know people don't say that, but there is sometimes an energy that, you know, I'm just an effed up person because I'm an alcoholic. I remember I was 20 years sober and I heard a friend of mine speak, and he said, well, I just don't know how to have relationships because I'm just an effed up alcoholic. And I'm thinking that's an interesting narrative at 20 years, right? And so when I started doing some of this deeper spiritual work with Mary Helen, I joined New Thought Community. I went to a Unity, which is ultimately where I had my education. I started playing with this idea of spiritual wholeness, and that we are actually whole and perfect underneath all the addictive behavior. And so that became the foundation for what has become conscious recovery. So it started with my own journey, but even more than that, when I started working in the addiction treatment field, I noticed how people were responding when I just held the energy of the infinite possibilities within them, rather than like, oh, let me help you figure out what's broken about you, because they were getting that from everywhere. I think about clients, you know, early 20s, like I was, their parents might think they're broken, you know, their schools might think they're broken, and then they come into treatment and they have a therapist that's trying to help them identify what's broken. And so I'm able to come in and say, what's great about you? What about your spiritual wholeness? So that became the foundation of conscious recovery.
You know, as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking about there's a guy named Ben Hardy. He writes for Psychology Today. He's a pretty well-known writer. He just wrote a book called Personality Isn't Permanent. And his whole thing is, I'm not the same person today as I'm going to be in 10 years. I'm not the same person today as I'm going to be in a year. I'm not the same person today as I'm going to be tomorrow. Like, we're constantly changing, right? And then, and you've got like Tommy Rosen. Tommy Rosen says, my name's Tommy. I'm a person in long-term recovery. He doesn't say, I'm Tommy, I'm an alcoholic. And it's like, okay, if you continue saying I'm an alcoholic, it's like if we want to be, it speaks to keeping your eye on the ball, right? Like, where do you want to go? Right. And so to me, I think about that. I'm like, man, I don't know how I feel about saying my name's Tim, I'm an alcoholic. My name's Tim, I'm a drug addict. Yeah. Because that's not how I want to identify. So why am I putting energy into that?
Right. So in my experience, and a lot of us say this, addiction's not the problem. It was a symptom of something, right? Right. It was trying to manage something. So in conscious recovery, I actually call it a brilliant strategy rather than a coping mechanism. Okay. I could lean into this conversation in a couple of different ways, but I'll start by saying the power of I am is really important, right? So it's an individual choice whether someone wants to say I am an addict or I am an alcoholic. My issue actually goes deeper. What I hear people saying is, I'm an alcoholic and therefore I'm just destined to have this lifelong disease that I can only treat on a daily basis. Well, what does that create to believe that? So not to be controversial about the disease concept, but to look at the power of language and where we put our focus. And if I'm continuing to affirm that I'm broken in some way, is that part of my maintaining a sense of brokenness? So if I recognize that shame is one of the root causes of addiction, which I do, I feel broken, then recovery would be about changing that narrative, beginning to look at that maybe that's not as solid as I once believed. Now, we could go down a slightly more controversial path, which I would love to, which is about personality disorders and the DSM, but I'll leave that to you if you want me to go there.
Hey, this conversation is going to go whichever way we're going to let it go. I mean, we've got a little bit of time left. So what's on your mind?
Yeah, so the DSM, for anyone who doesn't know, is the manual, if you will, of how clinicians diagnose and treat. Let me just start by saying it's incredibly well intended. The intention of it is, let me help figure out what's going on with this person so that I can help them. The issue is the way it often gets used is, let me figure out what's wrong with this client so that I can treat them. So in the Western medical model, we look at what are your symptoms and how do we eradicate them. When it comes to addiction, I see addiction as the symptom. It's the brilliant strategy, if you will, that's trying to manage something. The issue with what I see is with the DSM and with the whole medical model and the clinical model is I have sat in clinical meeting after clinical meeting in residential treatment and hear people referred to as their diagnosis, right? She's so borderline. What gets created when we look at someone as their diagnosis? Now, the DSM actually is a cluster of symptoms. So if you have 3 of these symptoms and 3 of these symptoms, or 2 of these from group A and group B, we call that a personality disorder. The issue, though, is people assume it's chemical or organic. And the truth is, we don't know for sure if it is with every person. So what I'm not saying is that's not true for some, but it might not be true for everyone. Why is this important? When I believe that it's something that is unchangeable within a person, or it's who they are, I can unconsciously start to look at them as broken. If I can use it as a tool to help them, it can be an incredible tool. So there's a nuance here. I'm not saying that the DSM is bad. What I'm saying is the way people use it, I think, can keep someone stuck. Yes, it can be true that getting a diagnosis can be a relief for someone. But if they then believe that's something that is with them the rest of their life, that might keep them stuck and limited because, as you say, our personality changes. So if we can shift the conversation from the symptoms into what's the root cause of it, then we can start to actually heal rather than treat. And to me, that's the deeper conversation here. I want to be part of changing the narrative from addiction treatment to addiction healing. Let's shift from the symptoms. Yes, they're important to address, but in addition to that, how do we get down to what's actually driving that? So a client, for example, that has a borderline personality disorder, the symptoms can be looked at, but what's at the root of it? The root of it is almost always, please see me, please honor me. There was an attachment wound early on, and there was trauma early on that created what we call this disorder. And we can spend years looking at the symptoms, but how do we actually help that person heal is what I want to be in conversation about.
Right. It's like, how do we move forward as opposed to being stuck in, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, I have borderline personality disorder, I have anxiety. It's, that's point A. How do we get to point B? Right. You can make it as simple as that. And to your point, I mean, it's like, how many subconscious thoughts do we have every day? Don't we have like 60,000 thoughts a day, and 90% of them are subconscious? It's right. Like we're continually telling ourselves, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an asshole, I lie, cheat, steal. I belong in jail. I belong in treatment. I belong on the streets. It's like it's as they say, whatever I believe about myself, it's true. Whether I believe I can or I can't, it's true. You're right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing that's important about this, and this is where we're getting to the sort of the deeper roots of conscious recovery. If we only treat symptoms and behaviors, nothing really changes. So the analogy I use, I like simple. So if I plant a maple seed, I'll get a maple tree. If I have a seed or a core belief, or as you said, an unconscious belief about myself, let's use an example. I am unlovable. If I plant an I'm unlovable seed in my unconscious or my subconscious, and I might not even be aware that I have that deeply held belief, what happens is I grow an I'm not lovable tree. And then I have all these branches that are I'm not lovable. And a lot of times in therapy or in treatment, we help them trim those branches or decorate them with lights. We might even help them cut the tree down. But if the seed of I'm not lovable doesn't get addressed, we continue to grow that. And then we have strategies, brilliant strategies to try to manage them. So if I have, for example, if I have a core false belief that I'm unworthy, my strategy for that might be to show you how good I am. So I might get labeled as narcissistic, or I might get labeled as entitled, right? So one's clinical and one is like, oh, she's so entitled, or he's so entitled.
Right.
But that's not getting down to the root of what's really going on. Underneath all that, we need to get down to where that seed got planted, those core false beliefs that we have about ourselves, start to heal those so that the symptoms start to kind of work themselves out rather than only focusing on the symptoms.
Right. You know, and what I'm thinking about now is, okay, if you plant the unlovable seed, if you plant the bipolar seed, whatever seed you plant, the unworthy seed, that's what grows. And guess what? That's who you attract into your life.
Well, that's it, right? Because that's where this is important, because as long as I'm in, and it's really popular today to say, I'm in a toxic work environment, or I'm in a toxic relationship. But what we want to look at is, yes, and it's not really about the other person, because not only did I attract it, but I was attracted to it. And there's no other possibility, because if I believe I'm unworthy, I will choose that life. Another way to say it is, I can only create the life I believe I'm worthy of. So in my case, I'll share from my case, one of my big seeds was I'm not lovable. And so I walked around with that vibration. So I kept choosing relationships to confirm that core false belief. Not on the surface. I kept thinking, oh, this time this person's going to be different. This time he'll be different. But it was always the same relationship, because it was my relationship with self. And so what I discovered is I needed to get down and start healing that. And a lot of that is about looking at where that originated and how I start to actually heal those core wounds that developed at a very young age when I decided, but even more than that, my favorite word, concretize that into my unconscious. That's the deeper healing work.
Can you repeat that word? It kind of cut out. Confrontized?
Concretized. Another word.
Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean?
It just means it got cemented, right? So, for example, when I was 5 years old, I decided I was stupid. I won't get into this story because I tell it so often, Tim. But I decided I was stupid at 5 years old. Now, I can say, well, of course, that's not true. But my little 5-year-old believed it so much that it's like that seed got planted, and then I put like 5 layers of concrete over it. That's why I love the word concretized, right? And so then in recovery, I thought I could change the narrative. But I couldn't change the narrative just by saying, oh, I'm not stupid. Look at all these things I've accomplished. I needed to get down and look at how that seed got planted. And the healing work for me was learning how to embrace that little 5-year-old and experience some of the emotions that I couldn't experience at the time because it felt too scary. That's the deeper healing work for me.
How long? And because I can relate, it's like I get sober, and then once I'm sober, then I start doing the work, and I continue doing the work, and I'm looking around at who, I mean, specifically, no, I'm not going to get into it. I look at who I'm attracting into my life and what I'm attracting into my life and the person I'm becoming. And as they say, it's like, I remember when I got my 5-year chip, people said, "Congratulations, you're no longer a newcomer."
Right.
I was like, "What?" I mean, but it takes time, right? I mean, if you've got layers and layers and layers of concrete, and you believe that you are one type of person, it takes time, and it takes a lot of work to get through.
This is the way I'll say it. It can take a lifetime, but it can also happen in an instant. This is why I have passion for conscious recovery and bringing it into treatment, because I think that one of the accepted narratives, and of course it was my experience, is that it takes time to heal all of this, which on one level, of course, is true. In other words, it takes as long as it takes. I don't want to ever go into self-criticism, because how many times have you said, Tim, or I've said, or someone we're working with, oh my gosh, I'm 40, I should be finished with this, or I'm 6 years sober, I should be finished. So I can answer it in saying that it takes as long as it takes, but I like what if questions. What if we could start addressing some of this much earlier in recovery? Because when I was new, and what I was told is, oh, don't worry about any of that. Right now, just stop drinking. And then I was like, okay, but I have this like so much anxiety, so much depression, so much fear. So I became curious about what might happen if we started addressing some of the underlying root causes right out of the gate. And we started to actually become curious about how we can heal the trauma, disconnection, and shame. And maybe we can change the narrative of, you know, it takes 5 years to even just have our head clear enough to start working on this. And I think in treatment, we co-sign on this by saying, well, we don't address trauma, and we have this face and we put up our hands. We don't address trauma. And I understand the spirit of that, but I think that's why we have clients in treatment 4, 5, 6 times. You know, this client's coming back and we have the arrogance to say, what are you going to do differently? When in addition to that, we need to be asking ourselves, what can we do differently? And one of the things we can do differently is start to recognize that we can address the underlying root causes much earlier and actually help someone shift all of this, rather than saying right now, just don't worry about that. Just don't drink or use. You'll be fine. Just help others, right? Just help others. And I understand all of that. And I even understand the efficacy of that. In addition to that, we also want to become curious about how we can start to heal much earlier in recovery, so that people don't have to have this experience of white knuckling it for many years until they can start actually getting down to the root causes.
White knuckling it. There are lots of people out there that white knuckle it for quite some time. Does white knuckling it work?
Well, I mean, sure, it can.
Temporarily,
right?
In the short term, right. Okay, so speaking to creating a new narrative to recovery, how does that work? How does a person go about, let's say a person is relapsed, 2, 3, 5, 14 treatment centers later, right? How does that person create the new narrative to recovery? Do they do it on their own? Do they need help? Do they ask God for direction? Like, what's the path?
I think there's a huge paradox here, right? Because here I come in and I say, well, conscious recovery says underneath all your addictive behavior is a whole imperfect person, and that the wisdom is within you. It's not the counselor, sponsor, or therapist's job to fix you, because you're not even broken. But the paradox is they also probably can't do it alone, right? So can we start to question? Because I think the power of the question is really important. Can we question the accepted narrative, right? Can we question the way we're talking to someone? So how many times have we seen someone relapse 5, 6 times, and then we say, well, are you willing to finally surrender and do it our way? Are you willing to finally let go of your will and surrender? I understand that, but can we also question that and say, wow, I wonder what's actually going on? What do we think is at the root of it? If we take the stigma and the shame out of relapse and addiction and start to ask questions that are empowering, like what really is wanted and needed in this moment, how can I, as the sponsor, the counselor, the therapist, really hold this space for the infinite possibilities in this person? And how can I partner with someone to start questioning some of the narrative? Because I can guarantee you that the person who's relapsed 7, 8, 9, 10 times is carrying a great deal of shame about themselves. That to me is the thread that I see in everyone that I've ever worked with is they feel broken or damaged. And so if we add to that shame of relapse, or, you just need to let go of your will, all of that can be true. But we also want to be curious about, when did you start feeling broken? Do you remember a time before you felt broken? How can we start reconnecting with that? The addiction is the symptom. So how can we get curious about the other two layers, which is, what are you trying to manage? Like you mentioned anxiety. A lot of times people say, well, I just have anxiety. That's who I am. So if we start to explore anxiety as a strategy rather than a condition, we can start to explore what it's managing, not through the lens of good, bad, right, wrong, but just being curious. I wonder what's underneath that anxiety for you. I wonder what's under that addiction for you. So that's really shifting the narrative and getting down to the infinite possibilities of every person to heal.
So what is your suggestion to, first we'll go with a person that really wants to be clean and sober. What's your suggestion?
Well, I think if someone really wants to be clean and sober, then the question is, what communities do you want to connect with? How do you, really take the time to explore what's happening within you? And I like the empowering questions of, like, what else is possible here? What are the infinite possibilities? What do you really need in order for you? Because I came in really willing, because I had that sense of disconnection. So I was just trying to, try everything to try to get better. And so it's like, who and what do you want to connect with to accelerate your recovery? And can you, through your willingness, can you use that as an opportunity to start doing some of the deeper work that underlies the addiction?
Right. I think above that, there's one of the things I always look at are lifestyle habits, right? So it's not just the deep work, it's the deep work and new eating habits, new sleeping habits, new exercise habits, new friends, right? New friends, new hobbies, new interests. I am a different person. And yeah, there's a lot to it. And I'm just really, really grateful that I'm where I am today. And I know you're grateful that you are where you are. Tell people, tell people how they can learn more about you, learn more about recovery. How can they contact you if they want to learn more about you and about conscious recovery?
Yeah, I think that the best is consciousrecovery.com. We do have a lot of online resources. There's an online course for people who want to walk through the entire conscious recovery method. And that's also something that could be a great add-on to whatever you're doing. We also just started online conscious recovery groups, so that's a great resource. So consciousrecovery.com is the best place to get started with it all.
Okay. I think that's all I got for you. Is there anything else? We're wrapping up here. We've got a couple more minutes. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with people?
Yeah, I just want to say this. If no one's told you today, you are a whole and perfect person. And just to lean into that and to feel that and remember a time when you also knew that. And can you go back to an early memory when you felt open, when you felt full of love and connection? And can you recognize that that person, that little precious being, is still within you? And can we become curious, each of us, how we return to that more and more every single day? So I could say, what if you're not broken? But I'll say, what if you're a whole and perfect person underneath all of it? And what would it be like to know that and to reconnect with that truth?
Love it. Because we are all whole and perfect people.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, TJ. Appreciate you very much. And everybody, goodbye. And hope you all have an awesome day.
Thank you, everyone.